Hello and welcome to GOMA Talks. This is the second in a series of 3 sessions exploring food, its production, consumption, symbolism, and its starring role in many forms of art. I'm Sarak Kanowski from ABC RN, and RN is delighted to be partnering with GOMA once again for the GOMA Talk series. And tonight's discussion springs from GOMA's current exhibition, Harvest, Art, Film and Food, which you here in the audience have hopefully had a chance to see firsthand. And it ranges from 17th century still lives to contemporary video, installation and photography. And if you're joining us out in the interweb ether, we also want you to be a part of this conversation. GOMA Talks is being streamed live by webcast, and we want to hear from you. Questions and comments by using the hashtag @GOMATalks on Twitter, or you can send an SMS to 048888 talks. And even if you're in the audience, we won't be stopping to take questions from you. If you want to participate in the conversation, and we'd love you to, then please do use Twitter @GOMATalks or SMS to 048888 talks. But let me introduce the guests for this evening to you. We have Joanna Saville, who is Festival Director for Good Food Month and Editor of the Sydney Morning Herald Good Food Guide. Paul West, who's host of River Cottage Australia, who's swapped life as a high-end chef for the life of a farmer. Be interesting to hear about the cultural implications of that. And Diane Kirkby, who's Reader in History at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And via Skype, we have from LA artists David Burns and Austin Young from the collective Fallen Fruit, sort of looming above us like a divine apparition. And their homage to the pineapple is part of GOMA's Harvest exhibition. You might have seen that as you walked into the theatre tonight. As you come in to GOMA, it's there on the wall next to you. So please join me in giving them a round of applause to welcome them. So, from the earliest cave wall canvases, food has been a favoured subject of artists. Historically, artists have used food to evoke abundance, wealth and status. Think of those 17th century still lives with tables laden with exotic fruits and wines. But images of decaying food have also reminded viewers of our mortality and warned against the sins of indulgence, gluttony and vanity. With the enormous transformation of food production that's happened over the last 50 years or so, it's globalisation and industrialisation, a new wave of artists are featuring food in their work. So what story are they trying to tell? David Burns and Austin Young, as Fallen Fruit, your art is all about food, fruit in particular. Why?
Well, food is probably the most primary form of culture if we go back thousands and thousands of years. And in our case, we celebrate fruit, which is one of those categories. It shows up in art more than any other food in the history of the world. It's aesthetic, symbolic, and it's accessible to all people on the planet.
Yeah, it's something we all share in common. Everyone knows the flavor of pineapple or a banana.
And so give us a sense of the kind of art activities that Fallen Fruit engage in.
We make everything from videos, public participatory projects. We often work with cities and think of city streets more like a canvas or a studio instead of just working in the ideas of framing photography or works in that kind of exhibition constraints.
We also think about bringing people together over fruit. We do public fruit jams. And we do a lemonade stand where we invite people to draw self-portraits on lemons, and we give them a glass of lemonade in exchange.
What we ultimately do is collaborate. So we're really interested in collaboration, not just between us or with an institution, but with the public at large.
So, Joanna Saville, I mean, this idea of collaboration, of bringing communities together, people together, this really is at the heart of food.
Well, it goes without saying, really, that mostly the act of eating, ideally the act of eating is a sharing and celebratory one, a very social one. I've just come from the night noodle markets, which is underway here at South Bank this evening, and there are thousands and thousands of people there congregating around the act of food, and it's something that, you know, has always brought people together over the millennia. And it's also part of that is it's very much who you are, what you create, how you eat. It's an expression of identity, something particularly for Australians I think that we've struggled with over the last 200 years, but we're starting to really get a bit of a sense of ourselves as a nation through the food that we grow, that we cook and that we eat. And so, it's very linked to community and identity for sure.
And Diane Kirkby, this idea of connection between food and identity, as a historian, are there big changes that happen across the last 200 years, say, in terms of our relationship to food?
Well, my work has actually been on the association between food and drinking and pubs and Australian identity.
Sounds like a tough job, Diane.
So, yes, that has changed.
What sort of ways? Give me a sense of the general brushstroke of those changes.
Well, pubs used to be the place, they've always been an important place where people have eaten. They've provided very kind of basic, nourishing sort of food at very low prices. And increasingly, of course, they've become much more restaurant, the gastropub and so on. But for a long time, pubs were all about drinking and Australian drinking culture and so on. And that was very much focused around beer. And now, as we drink much more wine, for example, that the nature of the pub has changed in relation to that.
There probably wasn't much food in pubs once upon a time, was there?
Well, it depended on the pub, I think, but by the licensing laws required them to provide food, so they always had to have a dining room and a bit of home cooking, which obviously didn't come up to scratch sometimes.
And always salt and vinegar chips, in my experience.
And always salt and vinegar chips. Meat pies and things like that. Yeah.
And Paul West, one thing we'll come back to with Fallen Fruit is the political nature of this relationship between food and art and culture. Issues of sustainability, of mass production, these are highlighted in some of the artworks here in the Harvest exhibition, and they've been issues for you as a chef and a farmer.
Yeah, well, the world has a lot of negativity kind of in it at the moment. I read a lot of books that kind of tell me that, everything's going to end in a couple of decades, and, it's a little bit intimidating sometimes. And for me, food is the natural starting point to self-empowerment. When everything's kind of, going to the dogs, food is a logical place to start, where I can actually start to do something and affect some positive change. Because you don't really need a lot of space or a lot of time or anything to do it. You can do it as simply as just caring about where your food comes from, and starting to ask those questions about how food's produced, and just informing yourself, and learning more and more about food, which is happening in Australia to a great degree at the moment. It's a great time.
We would love to hear your experiences of learning more about food, or perhaps how you're experiencing eating at pubs and beyond. So please do use Twitter, #GOMA Talks, or SMS to 048888 Talks. David Burns and Austin Young, let's head back to you over in LA land, behind or in front of some magnificent wallpaper. We appreciate that. Tell us about Pineapple Express, the work that features in Harvest.
Pineapple Express is a piece that we made for this exhibition, and we really looked at the history of the pineapple. If you go back hundreds of years, even before Columbus discovered, the New World, where pineapples come from, the pineapple was carried across the South American continent as a symbol of hospitality and welcomeness. And Columbus brought that around the world and back again. It's always been part of the symbol of being welcome as a guest, and also being receiving as a host. And that's part of
about a place. We think about, we were thinking about Brisbane, and that the pineapple seemed like a good fruit to do work about, and we wanted to connect people and get people to come together, and so.
So we invited the public to participate in this exhibition by inviting them to send in work from their homes or personal artifacts to sort of explore how we've celebrated the pineapple through domesticity and through the idea of vacations and things like that.
And you got an incredible range of artifacts.
Oh yeah, it's incredible.
We got a pineapple dress from Lisa, a piece of pineapple, a pineapple disco ball, ukulele, pineappleton.
Yeah, it's really amazing the broad range of stuff people are willing to share. It's kind of great.
It struck me looking at the objects how many of them were homemade. It seems like the pineapple is a fruit that's inspired people to, personal creativity.
Yeah, well, it's also funny because it seems like it's really just very popular, especially this year in mass culture. You kind of see it. I don't know if you guys see it everywhere in Australia, but I'll tell you in the United States, pineapples are everywhere. It's kind of great.
Yeah.
Pineapples are the new black. Is it... I have to ask if you've given, that we're speaking to you from Queensland, from the home of the big pineapple. In your work in Fallen Fruit, have you worked with other fruit theme parks, or is this a unique contribution that Queensland has made to the world?
No, when Ellie Buttrose we were originally talking to her. She was the curator that we were working with. We started researching, and it was just the most exciting thing to find that there was a big pineapple. We found that there was a big banana too somewhere.
It's true. Yeah, and there was a big macadamia nut, but I think that might have collapsed. But there's a whole lot of extra work that you could be doing here in Queensland. Diane Kirkby, from a historical point of view, the pineapple does seem an excellent choice. It's got a particular place in Australians' self-identity.
Well, it's very interesting. I was listening to the talk, and I remember standing at watching some pineapples being unloaded at LA Airport on one occasion. They were coming in great boxes, and I was thinking, why are they loading so many pineapples? And I realised they're grown in Hawaii rather than on the mainland. Am I right? Is that they're still not grown on the mainland of the United States? And I suddenly realised what we have in Australia is this wonderful abundance. We grow pretty well everything here on the mainland of Australia. That isn't true in other countries. So I think that's very particular, and it's got one of the great richnesses of of Australia.
And I think there's something about the pineapple as an item of kitsch, You just have to say pineapple and you guys are laughing. There's something about the pineapple that evokes some sort of humour that's different. I mean, I guess the banana might be up there as well, but it's not... some fruit are funny, and the pineapple is...
Isn't it also true that, Australian hamburgers have pineapple on them? I mean, that's...
and they're called Hawaiian. Hawaiian burgers.
I'd call them a
not
Wex
to
burger.
mention the ham and pineapple pizza.
Not to mention
the authentic Neapolitan ham and pineapple pizza.
So, Joanna Saville, I mean, talking about the place of food in art, there's also a sense that making food can be art. I mean, it's described as the culinary arts. Is cooking more of an art or a science in your view?
Oh, that's such a great question, and in the end, I don't know that there's probably an answer. It's like any artistic pursuit that there's also a craft. At what point is the chef a craftsman, or woman, and at what point is the chef an artist? Certainly in the realms of the super personality chefs around the world, the ones who get listed on top restaurant lists of the world, there are many who would see their food as an expression of themselves, of their story, their memory, their history, their emotion. Massimo Bottura is an Italian chef who's currently ranked top in the world from Italy, and his whole restaurant is full of artworks, and he references many of the paintings, contemporary art, many of the paintings on the walls of his restaurant in the dishes that he cooks. He also references his favourite jazz pieces, and he creates stories that actually tell the story of Italy, 500 centuries of Italian migration of the eel from the lakes of Comacchio to Modena, where he is, it's all in one plate, and you eat it in about 30 seconds, which is extraordinary. But, there is very much this notion that at some end of the chef's world, chefs are creating dishes, unique dishes that are telling stories that no one else is telling. And I guess, Paul, you'd probably have an opinion on this as a chef.
In terms of an artistic medium, there's not really many things that come close to indulging as many of the senses as food. I mean, you've got the taste, the sight of the food coming to the table, the smell, the texture in your mouth, that only leaves really sound out. And if you're at a table with good friends and you're having a good conversation, then that's all the senses totally indulged. I mean, as a chef myself, it's a very exciting palate to have access to, and as we can see now, that that top echelon of chefs up there, that even with what is essentially a very limited kind of palate, you can still come up with infinite combinations that are reflective of the individual's both proficiency and artistic drive. So.
There's a somewhat cruel tweet here that chefs can definitely act like artists, sometimes talk about divas. Yeah. So there's that side as well.
Yeah. Well, it's, sometimes, I don't know, I hope that's not referencing at me, because if it is, I'm sure walking out of here right now.
In fact, I mean, it's to pick up on what Paul was just saying. Just last month, a study came out from the University of Oxford where psychologists were researching the impact that the way food looks has on the way that food tastes. And so these scientists, I hope with the help of a chef, created a salad, one with the same ingredients. One was just a tossed salad arranged as in a kind of a mess. One was neatly arranged ingredients, and one of the salads was arranged like Kanowski's abstract painting number 201. And all of the respondents said that this final salad, the one arranged like the painting, tasted better. And in fact, and Paul, you might want to note this, they were prepared to pay more for the salad that looked that way.
Well, that's good to know. So if there's any prints available from the GOMA gift shop, I might take some inspiration. Well, even as an apprentice, and I didn't start at a particularly flash restaurant, but, just kind of a local bistro in Newcastle. Even there, my chef, when I was learning, was... you've got to take so much care in the way that things go onto the plate, because when you're eating things, the very first sense that is engaged, particularly in a restaurant, maybe not so much at home, is the sense of sight. You see it go up onto the pass, you see the waiter or waitress pick it up and carry it out, and you're already indulging, and your saliva's already starting to go, and you're getting excited, hopefully. Otherwise, you might be dreading your choice, and So that visual aspect of it is very important, and for fruit as well. I suppose that's why it's such an iconic thing to work with for you guys, because if you're walking through the bush or a forest or the jungle, in a hunter-gatherer society, fruit is the thing that visually sticks out. Like a bright coloured citrus or, a big yellow banana hanging off a thing. So our eyes are anciently trained to have that aesthetic appreciation of food and colour and the form.
And I think, can I just say, I was going to say that I thought I agree with you that it's because food engages all the senses, that's what art does, and that's why it is art. But also, if you think about it, it's what we need to live. And so the appreciation of it, the enjoyment of it, is very much connected to the fact that
without it, you die.
It's very much a matter of life and death, and I think that's what inspires art.
And that's why we need all the senses to recognise it and appreciate it and enjoy it.
Make sure we eat.
There has been a tweet about the relationship between food and class, and I think that ties into, one of the evolutions in the significance of aesthetics on food is the trend of Instagramming meals, which is sort of a status thing of people saying, I'm having this amazing meal at this amazing restaurant, have a look. So chefs have to pay a whole extra level of attention to visuals, given that that's the sort of message of their meals that's being sent around the world for good or for bad. Joanna, is that the trend of Instagramming meals? How is that affecting the kind of food?
Look, I think it's absolutely about the visuals, and you rightly say it is kind of a status thing. It's the latest in souvenirs, is what you ate, and you record it, and people sometimes spend more time photographing their food than they do eating it. But the other thing about it, I suppose, is that it's the new theatre, so that you might no longer go to a performance in a theatre of a traditional play, but you might go to a restaurant like the Fat Duck, Heston Blumenthal's Fat Duck, where every single dish that arrives is a theatrical moment. It has a story. There are interactive things that happen at the table. Things get poured, vapours appear, things melt and change form. So it's something that you can actually capture, of course, on your own personal device, but you can really experience that sensual element, all the essential elements of a dish that perhaps weren't so. When we were all hunting and gathering, and it was a little bit more primal, people didn't probably think that much about the theatrical moment of eating.
I thought, there's a big bison. I'm going to move quickly.
Yeah, but there was an element of it, definitely, maybe not theatrical, but definitely the spiritual element of eating, which would have been a theatre, and a lot of rituals involved. So even in ancient times, there would have been, and some of the most ancient forms of art are these kind of giant mythical spiritual beasts that were no doubt hunted for food, and we don't really have anymore. But so that's.
Yeah. I mean, when we're talking about sort of the high-end level of eating and the chef as artist, the one of the other interesting transformations that have happened over the last 20 or so years is this idea that the demarcation between the kind of food that you might have in a restaurant and the food that you have at home is not as strict as it once was. We're meant to be sort of doing something at home that's similar to what's happening in restaurants, which just fills me with terror beyond I can say. But connected with that change is the changing role of women in the kitchen. There's a really interesting video artwork in Harvest exhibition from the 1970s, an American video artist called Martha Rosler, and she has this depiction of a woman in the kitchen which kind of looks like a prison. It's a sense that was very strong in second wave feminism of the kitchen as a site of domestic drudgery, that women were going to shack off the second we had the chance. That's really been eclipsed, hasn't it, Diane, by this idea that there's a very positive identity marker around cooking and performance in the kitchen.
Well, also, I think there's much more, men that didn't cook at home with that when you had that demarcation. So I think there's been a significant shift in that way. But I think the idea of, food and the association with women's work is very old, traditional, and
I'm sorry.
It was also the case in pubs. When women were working in pubs, they were either in the kitchen or often behind the bar. Publicans would get a licence so that because they had to provide a dining room, then they had to have a kitchen, so that they would get the licence. Men would get the licence if they had a wife who could do those things for them. So there's always been this association that women are associated with the production of food. And of course the first industries that were actual food production was actually the first industry that was industrialised. And people think of the Ford motor car as being the first assembly line, but it was the food industries, and they were large employers of women. Canning and so on.
David Burns and Austin Young, I can see that you're signalling wildly from LA. What is it that you're wanting to contribute?
Well, we just want to echo and agree with that. I think one of the things that people overlook is the mechanization of food, and specifically fruit and canneries. It's something that revolutionized the way we experience food around the world, and the pineapple was really the gateway for that. One of the things, besides the fact that it's a fruit that becomes modern, is that the employment, the people who did the work in the factories and the fields, shifted to women around the time of World War II. And it just was this huge culture shift that has a legacy that's rather interesting.
And that's part of Pineapple Express is a series of, it's quite a sort of trippy LSD-looking video, but it is conversations that have been recorded with workers at the Golden Circle Cannery at Nunda, which is where a lot of pineapple was processed in Queensland, and it's workers talking about that assembly line experience.
Absolutely, yeah. I just think there's many aspects to food that we celebrate culturally, and the way we relate to food keeps evolving. I think it's rather interesting.
Yeah. We had one worker talking, and then I channeled the pineapple.
Sorry, you channeled the pineapple. Did you say?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Could you do that again for us now, live?
Well, it happened in Brisbane in my hotel room. I could try. Sorry.
It's not there, it's not coming through. But thank you for trying, Osto, that's wonderful. On that, we just want to say if there's any comments that you want to make, if there's any channeling of fruit that you want to share with us, then please do Use Twitter with the hashtag GOMA Talks, or send an SMS to 04888 Talks. And there've been a few comments. What got you laughing over there, Paul West?
Do you think hipster beards will breed a new way of eating? Perhaps how to strain soup through a stash? Well, that's a good question. I assume, again, it's referring to maybe this thing going on in my face, because I noticed, fortunately, that none of you lovely ladies have any beards. So
they're getting very popular.
The Fallen Fruit guys, one of you's got a moustache as well. So maybe we could come up with something there. I don't necessarily think it's a hipster thing, but yeah, minestrone. We could just get the pure tomato coming through there. I don't know. It's a good
sustainability on a whole new level.
That's what I'm going to be mulling over tonight for sure.
The Twitter is called Bogan Boobs,
Bogan
which
Boobs.
is also quite interesting.
Yeah.
If we're talking about where are we? There was another tweet that I thought connected to that. Well, there's one comment here about kids having taste buds on the inside of their cheeks until age 5, which is a fascinating piece of information. If it's true, we will trust. It's also Bogan Boobs. We're trusting Bogan Boobs.
Boobs coming through with the goods.
How much of this, and I'd be interested to hear from Austin and David and Joanna, maybe perhaps from your outreach work, is involving children differently in food. I mean, how much is this changing the way that food and education happens? In Australia, there's all of Maggie Beer's kitchen gardens. Is this part of the push that's happening to shift the way we're thinking about not just the mechanised end point of food, but having a new or re-engagement with the production?
I think so. I think there's, the rock star chef, the diva chef, also has the opportunity to be a responsible social activist to a certain extent, and someone like Stephanie Alexander and Paul, with the show that he does, can actually perhaps talk about food in a way that does change people's perceptions and attempt to educate people and to. I think most importantly, the notion that everyone should be able to feed him or herself, and that doesn't just mean being able to put things in your mouth, but being able to procure food, having access to good food, but knowing how to cook it as well. And so I think what you are also seeing with some of the chefs who are now big personalities is that they're able to influence change and become social activists, if you like. And I think that's a fantastic thing, and certainly Stephanie Alexander has been doing that and is doing that with children. Maggie Beer is now doing it with aged care and trying to change the quality of food that older people are eating. And Paul, with what he does with his show, and Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall before him, very much talking about where our food comes from and the realities of that.
How much of that is it a driver for you, Paul, with your work?
It's probably, for me, one of the most important things most important conversations that's happening in the world at the moment, because food production is incredibly far-reaching in its impact, not just socially, but environmentally and economically. And kind of going back to talking about kids and using that social activism, in my experience, because I've been doing this for like 2 years kind of thing, it's not exactly an old hand at the old TV gig, but the people that get it are the kids. One of the first things that really kind of shocked me about, being on screen was actually in Brisbane last time I was up here last year. This little kid, this little 4-year-old, drags his mum over and stands there like this, and then his mum's going, "Go on, tell him, go on." And this 4-year-old kid, no word of a lie, was, "I used to not eat meat, but then I saw how you killed a chicken on TV, and now I only eat chicken if it's killed like that." So it's like a 4-year-old ethical vegetarian. I was worried about finger painting when I was 4. So it's incredible. When it comes to food, I think that kids just instinctively get it, because, it's that survival mechanism. They would have been, pre-industrialisation out there foraging around in the bush looking for things to eat. And so when you take them out into a garden and they see a fresh sugar pea or something like that, they can't get enough. You literally got to go, save some for dinner, kid, but go for it. It's great to see you doing it.
That's definitely going to get the vegetarians tweeting. That comment, so we'll expect some of those comments in a good way.
Good on you, kid.
I think, though, that there's a comment here about pushing learning about cooking as adults in modern media? Why is home economics and learning cooking through school falling by the wayside? And I think that is a really interesting one. Diane was mentioning this sort of new melding between what happens at restaurants and what happens at homes. And I think that there's something about, Joanna, about this change in this. I've now completely lost my train of thought. You can jump in now, and I'll just have another sip of champagne.
Yeah, and people do say that this comes up all the time, that we're trying to educate children about cooking and where their food comes from and eating it, but yet learning good old home ec doesn't seem to be happening very much in high schools anymore. And then on the other hand, of course, you've got food as an extreme sport on television now, where everybody's competing, racing to cook boxes of mystery ingredients in all sorts of ways, which I think actually probably is quite intimidating for most people. That you no longer feel you can just bung on some spag bol at home. You've got to plate it up for a start.
And talk about it for 15 minutes and why you chose that sauce to go with that bolognese.
So, in a way we are, I think it is a little concerning because, and you can get, I have 20-year-old daughters, they can get takeaway like that. Fortunately, they know that it's cheaper to soak a bag of beans and make a bean ragu the next day, and that will last them for a week, or buy a curry paste and a few veggies and make something at home. But most people don't learn that anymore, and I do think it is a concern. It comes back to what I was talking about before, about people being able to feed themselves in a really, really basic way, and I do think those skills are going by the board, and yet we're all food obsessed. So how does
There's
that
a huge
work?
disjunct, isn't there?
It seems that the school now isn't so much about learning life skills. It's about academic high flying. You've got to get into uni. You've got to get the high marks. Whoa! You've got to get the high marks. So it's not about that life skill. It's about maximising your earning potential when you're out of school, not about trying to figure out how to live your life to its fullest potential.
So who taught you how to cook?
Well, I was a terrible, terrible cook when I left home because my mum was a legend. She was in the old school cooking food every night type thing. We never ate out. She cooked every night with a repertoire of about 5 dishes, but that was fine. Dad cooked twice in my entire upbringing.
And what were those occasions?
Sausage curry both times. First one edible, second one totally inedible. And then I started teaching myself, and then I kind of discovered gardening, and then I got interested in where food was coming from, and did a lot of work in community gardens and on farms. And then after that, I went, well, I can start to grow it now, but I still can't cook to save my life. So I started a chef's apprenticeship at age 23, and the most significant teacher would have been a very angry Frenchman down in Melbourne, I'd say. So definitely learnt by the flying fry pan was the...
the old fear technique.
Definitely, the physical intimidation and fear was pretty big on his agenda.
But I think Paul's drawn attention here to something that I think has been a significant change, and that is the extent to which you talked about your daughters eating takeaway, but the blurring of the lines between cooking at home and eating out is so much more common now. My kids, they take it for granted that half the time they're eating out, and it's much more of that. Whether it's at takeouts or it's at restaurants or
and
pubs,
they get food. They don't go and buy dinner. They go and get food, which is, I hate that expression. I'm just going to get food, Mum. Plus, they go out for breakfast now. I mean, really, if you can't cook your own breakfast?
That's the most accessible meal in the day
Joanna,
for the home cook.
You are not meant to be pushing this line. You were here as sort of for good food month. We're all meant to be at the night noodle markets. I mean, this is, you should stop now and think about what you're saying. Paul, I wondered, Joanna mentioned the sort of phenomenon of competitive cooking
towards your fellow staff. I think it's driven by the human drama. I think food's that kind of the common touchstone that we can all relate to. And having it as this competitive sport now is that that you can sit at home on the armchair and you can see people having a crack, and it's relatable because it's not it's not Heston Blumenthal doing it. It's just old mate bricklayer from
But they're doing
Parramatta.
Heston Blumenthal type dishes.
trying. Which
they're
is
not doing
intriguing
sausage
for
curry.
people if anyone, a producer from MasterChef is out there, John West, my father, is available to do a masterclass on the sausage curry. I'm sure he hasn't forgotten it. Third time's the charm.
And if you're joining us, MasterChef producer or not, whether you're online or on your radio, this is GOMA Talks, discussion on art, film and food, live from Brisbane's Gallery of Modern Art. I'm Sarah Kanowski from ABC RN, and my guests tonight are River Cottage Australia host Paul West, Good Food Month Festival Director Joanna Saville, and historian Diane Kirkby, and via Skype, fallen fruit artists David Burns and Austin Young. And we'd love to hear from you. Tweet us with the hashtag @GOMATalks or an SMS to 048888 Talks. Austin and David, are you again agitating to be included in this conversation, or are you smiling just out of good feeling in the fact that it's 1:45 in the morning in LA? Yes? Can we have some sound from these guys? Yes? Yeah?
Oh, yeah. Hey, Sarah. Hey, we're enjoying the conversation. Yeah, it's.
Well, what do you guys think? I mean, given that your work's about trying to connect communities around food through things like lemonade stands and community jam making, what do you think about the rise of the sort of celebrity chef and you know, competitive cooking on television? How does that fit with your understanding of food?
When in our project we're really looking at fruit in public space and in urban neighborhoods. So we like to think of it as the new fast food.
Because I think as you've said, part of your projects are about encouraging people to eat the fruit that they come across on fruit trees in their local neighbourhood. A lot of us have concerns about that. This idea that it's kind of not hygienic, or perhaps it's illegal to just take a orange from a tree, as I might in downtown LA.
Well, you probably want to make sure it's not illegal, but in most places in the world, it's not a problem. But the fear of food safety is a big issue, and ironically, it's actually not a problem. It's the opposite. Deciduous fruit trees are completely fine to eat. It's no problem. Anything that might be toxic does not go into the fruit. That's part of the plant's reproductive process. So it never is harmful in any way.
Well, the fruit trees, they'll shed the toxins through the leaves, but you probably want to wash it off.
We don't want anyone coming down with some terrible gastro after taking advice from the Fallen Fruit Collective. Talking about the relationship between visual art and food, there's also, of course, a very strong relationship with the performing arts, which I think, you know, we've kind of hinted at. This idea that that food preparation is a performance art, because a lot of kitchens, Joanna, have been opened in restaurants. And what's your sense of why that's a trend?
Look, I think it's part of that performance element that I was talking about before, and the restaurant as theatre. So not only do you go in and see a dish arrive on your plate that sometimes has something poured on it or that you actually interact with, but you also get to see the preparation of your food and all of the rituals and moments that go around that. And in a lot of restaurants now, the pole position is sitting up at the counter where you've got the chefs over the other side, so you can see every single element. And it's really intriguing and entrancing most of the time, because they're on show, they have to behave themselves, so there's no sort of grotty cloths and things going on, and certainly no F words. But it's part of the anticipation, I suppose, as well, of waiting to see what is coming to your plate, and that you know it's building up that momentum as well. It's great fun, and I think the open kitchen certainly enhances the experience. There are some open kitchens that aren't so gorgeous, in which case they should be closed. But you know, a beautiful open kitchen where everything moves almost balletically is a wonderful adjunct to the whole dining experience.
Yeah. Can I just say that I think restaurants have always been theatre, but the shift has been from the customer, who's actually always been performing and acting out rituals of class and gender and status in various ways. It's shifted now to the production of the food in the kitchen, but it's always been an element of theatre. And rituals and cultures around food, where it's eaten and how it's eaten and who's eating it and so on, have always been tied to society and the social context and issues about class and status. I notice quite a few of the tweets that are coming through are about these issues of class and poverty and this focus on, food when so much of the world is still in poverty. And I think when I'm teaching my students, I always say to them, food it's always about politics. Your point about having control, being able to change things by being in control of your food. The most powerless people in the world are those who do not have control over their food. And you can see this even from the time, human beings are born. Babies do not have the ability to feed themselves. They are the most powerless individuals in our society. And that's true on a global scale, if you don't have control over your food supply and access to your food. So I think we should always keep that in mind, that there's always a power relationship, there's always a politics, there's always a class and gender relationships that are being performed in relation to food and food sharing.
I want us to get to food and activism and how art connects all of those before we end. But just before we move to that, Paul, I'm interested to hear your opinion about the chef as a performer. I mean, you take that to one level as you're on television, but even without the camera crews there, are you a performer when you're cooking?
I'm glad you brought that up because, talking about the kitchen as theatre and the opening of kitchens is, as we've spoken about it from the perspective of the diner, of the person going in and watching the wizardry and the magic happen, but from the perspective of the person in the kitchen that's doing the work, now all of a sudden it's opened up a relationship because, so many kitchens are underground, tucked around out the back, and you might spend 16 hours a day sweating in there, cooking 200 meals, and never look a person that you cook for in the eye. And so because of that disconnect, there's also a level of apathy and resentment that can come through working in a closed kitchen because it's just a piece of paper with some words on it. It's not actually someone that's sitting there and enjoying a meal. And I think a lot of chefs forget that you might have been there all day, but this person has come in and there might be their anniversary and they might have been planning to go out for this dinner for 6 months, and just because you're in a bad mood, you can't, project it onto them and their meal. So having that open kitchen really does break down the barriers between the diner and the producer in the kitchen. And, it's fun. There is an element of performance to it because, you're moving, you're dancing, you're seasoning things, you're tasting things. Some people perform a little bit better than others. Some are, there's the very kind of, heavy-handed military types, and then there's the slightly more impassioned, twirly, high-salting, pan-shaking variety.
For those of us joining us on radio, Paul's now doing some wonderful calisthenics involved in cooking. And it seems that some cuisines are differently suited to this. There's that wonderful film, Jiro Dreams of Sushi, about the Tokyo sushi chef, Jiro Ono, and he stands right in front of the people who have come to his sushi restaurant, and he hands the food to them, watches them eat it, put it in their mouth with their hands. There's that eye-to-eye contact. It's a very close relationship between chef and eater.
And he also designs the size of the sushi piece for the person that it's intended for. So if it's for a woman, it'll be a certain size, and he actually gauges his customers and then moulds his sushi accordingly. And that's the other extension in a lot of the new top-end, pointy-end restaurants around the world too, is that the chefs not only are in an open kitchen, but they actually come out of the kitchen and bring the dish to at GOMA, for example, in Copenhagen, which is currently number one in the world. It's one of the things that they probably pioneered in a lot of ways, is the chefs all coming out of the kitchen to serve the diners with the dish that they've created.
And that's very important for my mind, for coming from the professional background of being a chef, is that you do need that relationship, because you're cooking for someone, and that's one of the best gifts that you can give someone, is that gift of nourishment and satisfaction and a hearty meal, So it's to put all that energy and love into creating a dish and then not actually be able to see it delivered and enjoyed. It's just kind of like wrapping up presents that you've crafted yourself and just putting them in the post and never even seeing where they go.
Not there. So we've only got 10 minutes or so left, so let's sort of bring some of these different themes together with this idea of activism connecting food production, consumption and art. And I'd love to go back to David Burns and Austin Young from Fallen Fruit joining us in LA. The byline, or one of the bylines on your website, is "Share your fruit, change the world."
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to take activism in one of its most primary forms, and it is a social thing, and the act of sharing could be really radical in the world. I mean, if we all shared, we would never go without. It's just a fact.
Yeah, so we think about the idea that if we all planted fruit trees on the edge of our properties, so that our sidewalks could just become like community gardens.
It would just change the way cities are experienced. That's one of the things that we really get behind and get excited about.
So change them nutritionally but socially equally.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no doubt. Those things should go together.
And I think, I mean, something that's striking me in the way you're talking about your artistic practice and its goals is a real joyfulness. This is not kind of hit you over the head activism. This is happiness.
No, in fact, the origins of Fallen Fruit as a project was, is it possible to take the agency of activism and not have opposition? Is it possible to do something that has that kind of energy behind it where it's just completely inclusive? The answer is yes, everyone can do this.
Well, yeah, like we think most forms of activism have polarization. So we were able to create a project where, I can't, if you don't like a banana, but I do, we're not really going to fight about it.
And who gets the rough end of the pineapple? Sorry. I had to do it sooner.
Because, I mean, there's the issues about food production, its globalisation, the industrialisation, the mechanisation, these things we've talked about. They come up in a lot of the contemporary works in Harvest exhibition. There's a fantastic video work by a collective from the Netherlands called Aeronaut Mick, Pulverus, which has got this sort of just slow pan of a supermarket, an Asian grocery store, with a whole lot of people just destroying it, just taking items off the shelves, pulverising, noodles, wrecking the walls. It's a really compelling work. I've gone through the exhibition a number of times, and people are stopped and fascinated by it. I mean, there's this underside of what we've been talking about more as the sort of positive celebratory aspects of food culture and food sharing, but as the other GOMA talks in this series focus on, there is the consequences for environment and health that are in the way that food happens now. So Paul, how much can you as one chef affect change, do you think, if we're thinking about issues of activism?
Well, I mean, I can only start really with what I do myself, and I'm fortunately in a position where what I do myself is broadcast on a television show. So, I mean, in a position where I am, I really hope that I can have some sort of positive influence. And in the experience that I've had over the last 2 series, that probably the most profound impact has been on kids. And again, going back to what I was talking about before, about how they kind of instinctively get it, the show has pictures of farms in a field, of pigs in mud, of chickens in a coop, and that's where food should be in a way. That's not the industrialised system where you'd look at it and it would probably give a kid nightmares if they saw where their bacon or their chicken or their eggs were really coming from, or their vegetables. They see that and they relate to that kind of idyllic farming landscape. So. And I think you've got to get in there early. Like that's, adults are very powerful. Obviously, we've got the most personal power, but to be able to impact on the way that children kind of think about things and see things from a young age, I mean, that has a great potential for the future, because realistically, the people that are growing up, now in primary school age now, food is going to be incredibly important to them, and it's going to be an even bigger global issue. I mean, we're just at the kind of the cusp of this enormous shift in food availability on the planet, and that tipping point between total industrialisation and a resurgence in small scale farming.
And Joanna, connected also with that, as a lot of your work has done with SBS and with the Good Food Guide, is how food is such an expression of cultural identity, and in somewhere like Australia, that there's been this embrace of a multicultural identity through food. But do you think we're in danger of that becoming homogenised out in terms of globalisation of food? Are we losing distinct food cultures?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we always like to talk about the way that our food identity has been shaped by all of the different food cultures that are part of what is everyday eating and drinking for us. I mean, all of us will, use a wok one night and cook pasta the next. So that's very much who we are as Australians. But, the history of food around the world before this incredible globalised age that we all live in was that food changed through trade, through colonisation, through availability, through climates, through all sorts of things. I mean, before Columbus, there were no tomatoes in Italy, those sorts of stories. So, I think we shouldn't be too negative about change and fusion of cuisines and new things coming out, because they always have. The polarisation that we're talking about, where you've got bad, cheap food on one hand that is more accessible to people, and usually slightly more expensive, better produced food that is less accessible to everybody, and finding that middle ground where perhaps people can understand that for environmental and health reasons, and actually ultimately for their own personal well-being, it is better to have good food that they cook themselves. Well, if we get there, it'll be wonderful, but I don't know if we will.
And on that distinctive food culture point, we won't eat public insects. Depends how high in protein they are, I suppose. On that distinctive food culture, if we start to move away from the industrial model, and we start to eat more in tune with the seasons, and we start to reduce the distance our food travels to our local area, we've got that access to the global technique, because we're living in such a golden age of food in culinary production. I mean, Terra Madre and things like, it's so free. The knowledge is sharing now. It's not, that's my secretly guarded recipe. They're like, this is how I do this and this is how I do that. But still, within that regionality of the actual food production, there is a unique element of ingredients, and there's unique flavours that are reflected by the mineral balance of the soil and the terroir.
Well, Paul, you were mentioning before we came on the panel that there used to be a tradition of eating Australian native birds, rosellas and other birds like that, and the flavour of those would vary depending on what the bird had been eating.
So I can't talk to this personally, because now it is illegal to eat Australian birds, unless it's a farmed emu. But some of the old bush characters down where I live in central Tilba, in fact, were telling me just last night that depending on what time of year there is, like bees and honey type thing, that whatever nectar and whatever trees are flowering, that the meat of that bird will actually taste that. So, I mean, there is an element of literalness, I don't know if that's a word, in you are what you eat. We feed corn to chickens and acorns to pigs in Spain to give them a very particular, unique flavour. So if we're eating what is grown in our region, then we really are the kind of salt of that earth.
Connecting to our soil.
Yeah.
And then you feed cows on corn and bits of other cow, and you wonder where the disconnect is happening. It's scary.
I think Fallen Fruit need to get to near where you live, Paul, and do a sort of series of artworks around the rosellas.
Unfortunately, there's no pineapples, guys. I'm sorry, but there's plenty of other great fruit going on down there.
That is where we will have to leave this GOMA Talks discussion here at the Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane. In 2 weeks, the final in the series of GOMA Talks, coinciding with the exhibition, Harvest Art, Film and Food, is going to be hosted by my colleague from RN, Paul Barclay. And he's going to be examining the politics surrounding contemporary food culture, looking at debates over food labelling, junk food, dieting. So some of the tweets that came up, and I'm sure some of the issues that have been raised for you by this conversation will be explored in more detail in a fortnight's time here at GOMA, or then later on your radios at Radio National. Please thank our guests. We had Joanna Saville, Festival Director for Good Food Month and editor of the Sydney Morning Herald Good Food Guide. And don't listen to Joanna, go to the food, go to Good Food Month, eat out.
No, it was
food out.
Sharing and celebration was the other element, though. Yeah.
And Paul West, chef and host of River Cottage Australia and farmer, and Diane Kirkby, reader in history at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And joining us from Skype at the very impressive time of 1:30 in the morning were artists David Burns and Austin Young from Fallen Fruit, whose work Pineapple Express is just outside as you leave this evening. And I'm Sarah Kanowski from ABC RN. Many thanks. Good night.